Welcome to Reboot Cyber with Avertro, the Boardroom series.
Hi Claire, and welcome to the first ever episode of Avertro's new web series. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Claire has worked in the security industry for over 20 years, is the director of the Security Collective and also runs a podcast for them, and is the best-selling author of The Secure CIO. So I'm very excited to have you on as our first guest. I thought we could start by just going into a bit of background in why you started in the security industry.
At the start of my career, I wanted to be a police officer, and I really thought it through for a while and ended up actually going to university and studying police studies and looking at how policing and operates as an organisation. And I looked at women in policing and I looked at the law, and it really drove me to want to do more than just work as a police officer. And I ended up working in corporate security for a long time, working with law enforcement and helping solve crimes based on information that Telstra had. So I was there for a long time. Moved into fraud and then eventually moved into cybersecurity about 9 years ago. So I've worked in security in one way, shape or form throughout my career. And for the last 5 years, as you mentioned in the introduction, I've run my own company, the Security Collective, and have the podcast, and really enjoying now being independent and being an interim CISO for lots of organisations who are looking for a security leader. Yeah.
Wow, it's a bit of a journey. But what I'd love to learn more is about why you started the Security Collective, what you felt was missing in the industry.
Sure. So about 6 years ago, I came back from working overseas, and I found that, like a lot of people who are repatriating, it's actually really hard to come back into Australia. And I'd been out of the Australian industry for 5 years, and I didn't know a lot of people back here apart from my small network that I'd maintained contact with. And the recruitment industry at the time, I found it really hard in security to get recognition of my overseas work and to also get recognition of my skills and experience, because I don't have a computer science degree. And so I jumped back into a head of information security role here in Australia. But after 12 months, I thought, I'm going to go out on my own and I'm going to start this organisation that helps companies to choose a really great security leader and the right leader for their organisation. And so I worked as the interim leader and still do while I'm recruiting for an organisation. And for all intents and purposes, I am that leader until we find the right one. And I go through a process where I'm living and breathing that job. And so for candidates, I can go to them and say, this is what the risk profile is like. This is what your boss would be like. This is the culture. This is what I'm experiencing. And it means that as a candidate, they get a much more thorough understanding of a business before they put their hand up to join a shortlist, and far more than a job description could show them. And I'm sort of a living, breathing job description, I suppose, that will help them to really understand, is this the type of business that I want to go into? And is this the type of security role that I can add value to? So, yeah, I've been doing that for the last 5 years, and throughout that process have helped lots of organisations to find a really great security leader that matches the maturity that they need in skills and capabilities.
And I can only imagine how valuable it is, and then that also helps retain them as well, because you're going in with a clear understanding of like what this job is for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess what I'd love to start and unpack with you, and what we're particularly interested in at Avertro, is like exec teams and cybersecurity teams. And I guess my opening question to you really is around where you see the biggest disconnects that stem from your exec teams and your cybersecurity teams.
So I think there's a few disconnects between execs and cyber. And I guess it really starts with how involved cybersecurity is in the organisation. And that sort of has a lot to answer for, I suppose, because cyber is often seen as this group of people that come along at the end of a project and they're at the go, no go meeting and they might say no because they haven't had involvement throughout the journey. And so, you know, a big project might be ready to go live, but if security hasn't been considered, then it can often be a real pain point for both the business and security to have that conversation at the 11th hour. And so that between executives and the security team can be a really tough conversation to be having. if relationships were built earlier, that can make a huge difference as well. So it's really about having early conversations about projects, early conversations about building security into the way an organisation operates, but also where that security leader sits in the organisation. So it depends on what survey you read, but a lot of security leaders still report to a head of technology or a CIO. And there's some arguments about whether or not that's the right place for a security leader to sit, because they are quite focused on tech, but they also then can't be independent if everybody they're dealing with every day and the security leader have the same boss. But what I would say is there are lots of businesses out there that wouldn't necessarily benefit from the security leader sitting, say, under the CEO, because as an organisation, they may not yet be mature enough for that reporting line and that relationship to be in place. Mm-hmm. And I guess at some point we're going to have to dive in, and that's going to have to happen, because as a CISO and as a C-level leader, we need that person in the upper hierarchies of organisations to be really making an impact. So having regular conversations with the CEO rather than that having to happen through their boss or through other channels.
So would you say those that are reporting into, say, a CIO, they're best to continually have those relationships where the CIO is bringing them into meetings with the CEO?
Yeah, I think allowing them to have an independent voice, and I mean, wherever you sit in an organisation, as long as you have access to decision makers and the board and the audit and risk committee, and you have a boss who is interested and understands cyber to the extent that they can support you, empower you and fund you to do the things that you need to do, that's the important part. That it doesn't matter if you sit under the CFO or the CEO or the head of technology, it's the security leader having that open conversation and having their own relationships with different people in the business, and not necessarily sitting behind another C-level executive, because I think the message can get watered down, and not necessarily deliberately, but just through additional channels. And if there's an incident, you want that security leader to have the trust and relationships with the senior executives, so that on the day they can come forward and everybody's already met and knows their place in an incident, for example.
I guess one of the biggest disconnects that we see and we talk to our clients about is, how do we translate cybersecurity strategy in a way with the business that connects to their overall business strategy? And from your experience, what are some of the tips that you would recommend that the two are working better hand in hand?
So the cybersecurity strategy should be written based on where the organisation is going. So you need to know what the business strategy is, and also what the technology strategy is. Even if you don't report to the tech leader, where is technology going in the organisation? What if the business has a strategy around really aggressive mergers and acquisitions? That could mean the security team is heavily involved in due diligence. Once acquisitions are made, they could be really knee-deep in merging companies together, merging data together, giving advice around bringing staff together. That's a very different strategy to if your organisation is maybe heavily focused on customer acquisition, and therefore lots of third parties are involved in marketing and advertising and seeking out customers to come and then retain them. So as a security team, you don't want to be over here focused on identity and access management, while meanwhile you really need to focus on third parties or on security due diligence. Or if you have a tech team who's focused on cloud first, you don't want to necessarily be investing heavily in on-premise infrastructure, for example. So the three really need to go hand in hand. And again, it comes back to what you said earlier around the those conversations with the CEO and the executive. For the security leader to really be a part of what other parts of the organisation are doing, they've got to be having conversations about the security strategy, having workshops, asking them, what are your risks? What are your exposures? What are you worried about? So the security team can help to protect those, critical information assets that different parts of the organisation are either creating or are responsible for.
I guess, and being more involved in quarterly planning, yearly planning, things like that, rather than doing things separately and then coming together at the fifth hour. I'm noticing a common theme is relationship building across the whole company.
Yeah, exactly right.
I guess one thing, again, from your expertise is what would you see as like some of the top, maybe even 3 strategic metrics that you think CISOs or security leaders should have at their fingertips when they are approaching like execs?
So this is a really difficult question because lots of people would say that there's a standard set of metrics out there that every organisation should be tracking in relation to cyber. But when it comes to strategic measurement, it does heavily depend on what your strategy is. So, if your strategy is around risk reduction, then you want to be able to talk to where you are today and how you're moving the needle. And that's a bit of a cliche, but how you're moving the needle from, where you are today to where you want to be in 3 years' time, and how are you tracking that over time to make sure that you're kind of heading in the right direction. For some other companies, they're already sitting within risk appetite, and so their strategy might be to maintain that position. And that could mean lots of different metrics that you need to have at your fingertips. And so I sort of feel like there's no right answer to what metrics need to be available to a CISO at any given time, other than being able to demonstrate that the work they're doing both strategically and in their kind of business as usual is helping the organisation to stay secure, but also resilient to whatever threats or risks that are realised could come along.
And I guess that kind of like plays into how you communicate to the boards or the execs as well around the language that you're using. I think when I've spoken to exec teams, they're saying, they'd love ways where your cybersecurity team can translate like cyber maturity and risk-related information in a language that they better understand. I guess what is some of your advice to security leaders in communicating that?
So I'd say a couple of things. One is be careful not to take data to the board. So you can obviously provide them with a dashboard or a metrics spreadsheet or however you want to detail that information, but try to take sort of a humanised or contextual approach to the data that you're taking to the board. So here are some metrics, but what do they mean for the organisation's risk position, or what do they mean for the compliance that the organisation might be working underneath? There's lots of heavily regulated industries. So, are these metrics that are being presented to the board, are they within what they would expect for compliance to their regulatory framework? For example, for financial services, there's a lot of companies that are exposed or under the rule of APRA. So are these metrics, are they right? Are they hitting industry benchmarks? So helping the board to understand how what is being presented can help the board to make their decisions. So it might be about giving you funding, or it might be about the financial state of the organisation, or it might be about risk. All of those things help the board to make their decisions. So instead of just taking data points to the board, really making sure you think through, why am I telling them this information? So what? We've got this data. Or so what? We've thwarted a number of cyber incidents this month. What does that actually mean for the organisation? And it could be about visibility of the network, or it could be about, other incidents that are happening in your industry. Helping the board to understand why that information is important to them is incredibly important. And I would also say too that helping the board to understand what they need to know as opposed to what you want to tell them. So some organisations have leaders that would go to the board all the time with good news. So great news, we're on track with this project. Great news, we've submitted our attestation to a regulator. In real life, there's not always great news. So, going to the board and telling them what they need to hear for them to be able to discharge their duties, as opposed to going to them to tell them what you want them to hear, which isn't always necessarily helpful and could actually put them in a position where they don't have enough information to make a decision. So really thinking through, I've got to write a board paper, what should I be telling the board? And especially if that security leader isn't the one to present the information, board paper needs to stand on its own. And it could be out of date by the time the board reads it, or by the time you talk to them about it. So, thinking through the value of what you're trying to say to them and what you need from them as an ask based on the information you're providing.
Yeah. And if I guess they want to understand the need better of what the board should be seeing, is that, do you think by having constant relationships or communications with them, it would better guide their paper?
Absolutely. So there's a few things that they can do. One is to have relationships with board members outside of the board, and there are many directors who would welcome the opportunity to have out of board meeting conversations with security leaders to ask questions that they don't have time for or necessarily don't feel confident asking in front of their directors as peers.
Yeah.
But also the chair of the board and the company secretary are two really great resources for security leaders to understand really where the board is at in their thinking and in their level of education. And the third thing I would say is that security leaders really need to understand who is on the board. So research who's on the board, have a look at their backgrounds. There are some board members who would be really keen to see financials. There are others who would be really keen to see the legal position. Really depends on their background and how they want to consume information. So knowing your audience is incredibly important, no matter what you're going to present to them, because if you can preempt some of their questions and think through, if I was given this information, what questions would I have and does this make sense? It will help the board to really understand where the security leader is coming from, but also vice versa.
Yeah. And I feel like from this conversation, there's so many great insights for both security leaders and execs to better communicate. And I'm seeing a common theme of relationships, but kind of to summarize this, what would be, if someone was to listen to this, what would be some of the 1 to 3 key strategies you think that are beneficial for both of them to know for one another to better enhance that relationship?
So the key things for me would be making sure that as a security leader, you're well across the business strategy and also the annual report. So knowing what business you're in and where that business is going and how they're travelling and being able to have that conversation with the executive and the board. So link to the business strategy if you're writing a cyber strategy or even refreshing your cyber strategy, and keep an eye on where the organisation is going. The second thing would be to really build relationships throughout the organisation and make sure that the business knows where security is involved and where they're not, and how you could maybe increase the involvement of security in your business and how you do business. And I think the third one is really about knowing each other, knowing your audience. And I'd encourage directors to know who their security leader is as well. If you've never met your security leader and you're a director, then that's your homework to find out who in your organisation is taking care of cybersecurity on your behalf, because at the end of the day, directors are absolutely accountable for the responsibility. Directors are absolutely accountable for cybersecurity in every organisation. So that would be my 3 tips. Know where your business is going, build relationships in your organisation, and know who your audience is in relation to cyber, be it the board, the exec, or even the security leader.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Claire. It's been a very, very informative session. Stay tuned and keep across the Avertro socials, guys. We'll be dropping new videos like this each month with thought leaders just like Claire. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.